Teresa Ngoan, cảm ơn quý vị theo dõi chương trình hội thoại ngày hôm nay của chúng tôi. We're back now with Mr. Sherman. Let's continue our talk because it was a very interesting talk that we had earlier today. What do you think are the problems in understanding the Vietnam War? If you can tell us in what you think.
From my point of view, is that the people who opposed the war while the war was going on did so because they were subject to the draft. And they did not want to be drafted to go to Vietnam. And that was the motivation for their opposition, not any facts that they had. They adopted facts that they received from communist sources, and that became their view of the war. Unfortunately, if it had remained that way, it would have been all right, but it didn't. In order not to be drafted, I think that they stayed in school to keep the deferment. They went to teachers' college, they went to journalism schools, they went to schools of social work, and they even went to law schools. And the output of those schools is what we've produced today. And they have to maintain their self-image by claiming that they were right in opposing the war. Surprisingly, there are a number of people there who are now claiming to be Vietnam veterans, and they opposed the war before.
Wow. So, Mr. Sherman, I want to ask you a very important question. The majority of America wants to forget about Vietnam as if it never happened. Now, but not you. Why do you care so much about the history of the Vietnam War? Why does it matter? Why is it still personal with you?
I don't think the majority of Americans wants to forget the war.
Yeah, the reason why I asked because it was so highly unpopular, and there are a lot of opposing views against the war.
As Burns said, it was the source of the polarization. But unless you understand that polarization, unless you understand that history, you can't draw any lessons from it. You can't use it to decide what to do tomorrow from the misinformation you have about the Vietnam War. And Burns' view is that you just listen to what he has to say, and that should be your picture of the Vietnam War. Well, it's wrong. And we want to correct that picture.
And that's why we're having this movie.
And that's why we're having this movie. But it's also not a fact that people are not interested in the Vietnam War.
That's just an assumption, but it's a wrong assumption.
It's a wrong assumption. I think that you'll find that if somebody offers a class on the Vietnam War, the people who will come to see it will surprise how many people come to see it. All right? But in the schools, they're reluctant to teach it. First of all, it comes at the end of the semester. There's a lot of history to get into.
Right.
They don't want to get into arguments with the parents about what they're teaching. So they avoid teaching it. They avoid a lot of subjects in school. They avoid civics and history beyond the Vietnam War. And they're dumbing down the kids that are graduating who are going to be there to decide what our countries will look like in the future. So we can't let them do that, although I'm very frustrated that I have very little influence on that process.
So, which leads me to my next question. Why do you think that the media in general and the academians still get it wrong about Vietnam?
The academics are people who oppose the war, or the previous generation of academics were people who opposed the war, and who would not allow any divergent opinions to exist on their campus because they couldn't afford to compete with them on the basis of argument.
What about the media? Why do you think the media oppose it so much?
The media has had the same history. This magazine number 3 that we're doing here is on the Vietnamese Americans. The next magazine we're doing is going to be on the media.
Oh,
and a lot of your questions will be answered in that magazine.
So, which leads me to my next question. What was it that they were wrong about? I'm talking about the academics and the media, the American media.
They saw the view, they did not accept the policies of the United States. They felt that their job was to be antagonistic. Their job was to oppose it. When you understand that by U.S. law, the government of the United States is not allowed to propagandize its own people.
Right.
They can have Voice of America, Voice of Vietnam. They send it somewhere else, but they can't send it into the United States. Then the official line has to come from somewhere, and the media is opposing it. So where does it come from?
So there are misunderstandings somewhere. Where do you think the misunderstandings are coming from?
The misunderstandings are coming from the fact that they took propaganda as evidence of the way to see the war. The Americans were the aggressors in this war, according to the communist propaganda. Right? They accepted that propaganda and they promoted it. They built their picture of what was happening around that. Our perspective has always been that it was a North Vietnamese aggression against the South. And we really saw very little reason for media or teachers or anti-war activists not to perceive it that way. The war's been over for a very long time. South Vietnam is a colony of North Vietnam. You can't tell me that you can't see from what's happened in Vietnam after the war who was the aggressor in that war and what we were fighting to avoid happening to the people of South Vietnam.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. So for a minute or two, let's turn our attention to the difference or your thoughts about communism and socialism.
One of the arguments that was being made by the anti-war forces was this was a war between capitalism and communism. And they said capitalism has its problems, communism has its problems, but we're going to deal with them as just two different economic systems. Okay. This was never a clash between economic systems. The communists used the idea that they had a Marxist economic system because they took their homemade figures and promoted communism as a way for third world countries to industrialize quickly. It wasn't true, but that's what they promoted. The United States went into this war not as an economic matter, but as a matter between totalitarianism and freedom, not capitalism and communism.
So the conflict has happened 50 years ago. Why is there still such a preoccupation about the Vietnam War?
Because every time anything happens in the world today, somebody raises the specter of Vietnam and says, we don't want another Vietnam.
Right. They reference
On what basis are they making that statement? How can you draw a lesson from something when you don't know the facts about what actually happened?
Which leads you to your
We had another little pamphlet, which is, why is the Vietnam War important after 50 years? So we address these questions in some of the publications that we put out.
And that is also a teaching tool, you think,
Yes.
for the American education system?
Well, the American education system is very resistant to anybody coming in to the system. I have read the article that your son
My son Max Pham, yes,
wrote. And I was very impressed by the fact that he went ahead and did his own research. And that's important not only about the Vietnam War, but everything that he studies. When you don't agree with what's being taught, or you wonder what's being taught, check it out.
Right. So yes, I have a special child who pretty much test out authority and he tests out the system. He's pretty much an independent thinker. So, when we were doing this project, he became very interested because we do talk to our children at home very freely about all subjects, but including the Vietnam War, because it's a subject that's very dear and near to us since I grew up here since I was 3 years old. However, I still have this huge interest in my roots and my heritage. So I want to pass it on to my children, and I want to make it something fun and interesting, something that the family can talk about. So as we are talking here about all of your magazines, your publications, and the new documentary coming out with Mr. Fred Koster, how do you think that is going to help change the views about the Vietnam War? First with the Americans and then second with the Vietnamese.
Well, I think the way it's going to be done is to make this material available to a wider audience. And frankly, less people read today than watch video. Exactly.
Reading takes a lot of mental capabilities. Yes. And video is a lot more entertaining.
And it also will capture the images of people who may not be there in the future.
That's true. There are a lot of living, how do you say it, the people who are the representative of the history, the living history. People get to tell it in their own views, in their own words, what happened, what truly happened. What can we do to set the record straight? I mean, we know that there are a lot of misconceptions. There are misrepresentations about the Vietnam War, especially in the Ken Burns movie. What do you think we ought to do to set the record straight?
First of all, you and the other members of this community are representatives of an opposing view to what's being taught. Right? You have a history and a knowledge and understanding of what happened in Vietnam, what happened with communism and socialism, that people in the United States have not had to deal with. And your voice is very important because you have experience, whether it's your generation or the generation before you. You're witnesses. And what you say has more credibility than somebody who's only read a book.
Very powerful. Thank you very much, Mr. Sherman. And this is my last question to you. How do you think we can influence Americans' public opinion and public policies, American policy?
It's very difficult for anybody to move the behemoth that is the American society. But you have to speak out on what you know and what you think and what you feel. You have to vote, you have to talk, you have to educate your children and educate the people around you. And that's basically what you can do. But you cannot let things pass without comment. When you do it, it reinforces them and lets them get away with information that they shouldn't have.
So wonderful. So let's talk about it. Let's make it something that it's something that the family can gather around and have an open discussion. Even among friends, among colleagues, we can talk about the Vietnam War openly as if it's something that's still popular, something that that you are not ashamed to talk about. Right? And it's something that you can speak freely about, because here is another misconception, I believe. A lot of people believe that it's somehow political. Now, how is making a movie about the Vietnam War or the history of the Vietnam War something political?
Well, we addressed that in one of our issues, because we had a number of veterans groups who said, we don't want to get involved because it's political.
Exactly.
And we pointed out that being a witness is not a political act.
Exactly.
You're just stating what you think and know.
I know, because a lot of people are afraid to make a stand. They are afraid to even say, hey, I support this movie. I think it's a good work. A lot of people support it, but in a very hushed up way, in a very secretive way, because they don't want people to know that they are supporting it. For some reason, I get that feeling among my friends, among people that I have talked to. They secretly support you, but they're afraid to speak up about it.
Let me give you an example from when I was younger and going to college. I was at an Eastern university, and there was a very strong, it was protest group, student movement. And one time there was a speaker who was brought into the campus to speak about Cuba and how wonderful things were going to be in Cuba after the revolution.
Castro.
And he came in, he spoke. And he was a very persuasive speaker. He'd been going around the country doing this. From the back of the room, one young man got up and he said, I'm a refugee from that Castro paradise. And what you have to say is wrong, and here's why.
Wow, good for him.
And that was something that I remember
It's something
for
you
all
remember.
my life, and I'm sure many of the other people who were with me did as well.
Exactly. So you just proved the point that it's different from reading a book or from reading a magazine versus an actual person who said, I have lived through this ordeal. I have gone through refugee camps. I've gone through, being an immigrant, the boat people. I've done the re-education camp. I've been in prison, that kind of stuff. If you hear someone speak from their heart, from their own experiences, it will definitely touch someone else and have them remember it as something important.
I expect we'll capture a lot of that in Fred's film, but that's not the only opportunity that members of this community have to express themselves.
So what do you think are additional ways that we can help to support VVFH?
Well, I think I went through them before.
Yes, but let's just recapitulate so that everybody can have another understanding. Just summarize for us, please.
Support the film, speak out, talk to your children, talk to your parents and grandparents.
And friends.
And friends. If you want to exercise your skills, writing something that we put out, helping with media, social media, or helping with programming projects. There's lots of places where you can fit in.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Sherman. Mr. Steve Sherman, who is the Managing Director of the VVFH, which stands for Vietnam Veterans Factual History Organization. Thank you so much for your time, for spending a whole segment with us today and talking to the audience of Saigon Network TV. Teresa Ngoan, cảm ơn quý vị đã theo dõi chương trình ngày hôm nay. Xin kính chào quý vị.
Thank you for having me.